can have a conversation. I'm going to pause at various points for us to discuss some cases, but really feel free. This can be a sort of free-flowing hour. If you have questions, jump in, and I'm happy to take them as I'm talking. I have to say, so I am a faculty member in an academic department, but I'm also a federal employee, and so we have academic freedom. We can say whatever we want, but we have to be clear, we're not speaking on behalf of the federal government. So when I say the things that are controversial and with which people disagree, it's just my views and my views alone. So let's start with a little bit of background. You guys might already know this, so forgive me, but we've moved from an era where we were just doing targeted sequencing to this next generation sequencing era where we can sequence someone's entire exome or entire genome. Next generation sequencing is a powerful research tool. It's also a powerful clinical tool. And the interesting thing, the powerful thing about it is that it generates massive amounts of data about an individual quickly, and as you can see from the chart to the left, increasingly cheaply. But in generating so much data about people, it gives you more data than you need to answer your scientific or clinical question. And so that raises an interesting ethical question. What do we do with this information, particularly the clinically relevant bits? Do researchers, do clinicians have an ethical obligation to return these incidental or secondary findings, the clinically relevant findings that you find in someone's genome that aren't related to your research question or the reason you're clinically sequencing them? So what do we do with that? It's been a topic for the past decade or more. It's something that there's a lot of literature about it. And just to define our terms here, we're talking about secondary genetic findings. These are clinically important information discovered in the course of conducting genetic research or clinical sequencing.
Yes, thank you.
That's unrelated to the primary sequencing objective. So let me just give you an example so people can have it in their head. Let's say you come in to a research study because you have some interesting rare heart condition that they want to do more research about, and they sequence you to try to find out whether there's any genetic basis of that heart condition. And in the course of the sequencing, they discover that you have some predisposition to a specific kind of cancer, where you could, if you do extra screening, you can maybe mitigate the effects of that cancer. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. I want to pause here and give you a case. Let me read the case, then I'm going to stop sharing my screens, because I'd love to, as a table setter, as a way to sort of get into this topic, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So imagine P, she's having her genome sequenced, and during the informed consent process opts not to receive any secondary results. Just to specify, let's say there was just a couple sentences that say, like, we might be able to find other important things in your genetics. Do you want to know this information or not? And there's a checkbox, and she checks no. But during the analysis, her research team finds evidence of high genetic risk for a kind of colon cancer that's not normally detected on regular colonoscopy. And this is a kind of colon cancer that's almost uniformly fatal if you don't catch it early. But if you catch it early with enhanced screening that you would know to do because you have this genetic risk, you can catch it early, you can cure it, basically. And so they believe this information would prevent serious disease and could even save P's life. So the question is, should they disclose the finding even though P indicated that she didn't want to receive any secondary findings? So let me stop sharing so I can see people. What do people think? Should they give it to her because it could save her life, and even though she said she didn't want to know, that's not that important? Or should we say, because she said no, she clearly checked a box that said she didn't want this kind of information, should we honor that choice and not give it to her?
And if you'd like to comment, you can feel free to unmute yourself, and better yet, even turn on your camera and let us know what you think.
So I already see in the chat there's a no and a yes, which is great. But what do people think? What should they tell her? Shouldn't they tell her? And if so, either way, why?
I'll give my opinion just as a person. If I were in such a scenario, what I want to say is yes, they should tell her because they know that they could save her life. But then I'm realizing at the same time, if you found out something about me, but it was terminal and there was nothing you could do about it, I wouldn't want you to tell me. So it's a yes, tell them if you can help them. No, don't tell them if you can't help them.
That's an important distinction. So let me be clear. We're only talking about clinical information where there's something you could do about it, whether it's a treatment or a preventative action. So we're not talking about something like Huntington's disease where there's nothing you can do about it. Or Alzheimer's. I mean, maybe someday we'll be able to do something significant about Alzheimer's, but right now we don't really have great tools, and so we're not talking about those kinds of things. We're talking about cancers where extra screening would help, heart disease where extra monitoring or losing weight and being healthier would help. Those kinds of things.
We've got a hand up, Mobo Dawale. You want to unmute yourself?
Yes. So I was just gonna say, even though she consented that she didn't want to get any secondary information, I think it's good clinical practice to go back to and offer the opportunity to either reconsent or to say no again, and just to let her know, okay, we find valuable secondary information. Would you like to know? And that way she's given like the option to say no again in a way. And just to reemphasize that you want to be, as a researcher, you want to be able to let her know the importance of the information that you might have for, and then again, give her the option to say yes or no to it, just in case she doesn't really understand what she might have checked no to at the beginning.
So that's an interesting point. Like, go and I'm seeing some similar comments in the chat. Go back to her, sort of ask her again, say, hey, we found something really important. Are you sure you didn't want to know? The problem with that approach, and I'm not saying you can't do it, but the concern is that if in going back to someone and asking them again, if they really didn't want to know, that knowledge that someone else has a really important piece of information about you is almost irresistible. So if they really didn't want to know, you're almost forcing them to change their answer by telling them, hey, we have something important we want to tell you. And if the whole point here is to honor someone's autonomy, if they really want to exercise a right not to know information, telling them, hey, you sure you don't want to know this really important thing that we've already learned and would like to tell you? Like that's, if you're worried about triggering anxiety in them or other psychosocial effects, telling them that you have a piece of information that's going to probably do that, even if you're trying to just engage with them further and get their more informed consent.
We've got another hand, Matt Lebowitz.
Yeah, I said this in the chat, but I figured I would raise my hand. I had the thought that, and I totally agree that going back to someone and saying, I know you said you didn't want to know, but we have something. Are you sure you don't want to know? It really kind of, you're the whole reason they said no, presumably, is because they don't want to think about information that you might have found. So once you've gone back to them, you've already kind of violated that. So what I commented in the chat was that it seems kind of pointless to ask people in the first place about whether they want to know the information if you're just going to tell them regardless of what they say. So why ask if you're then going to go back to them? They've had the opportunity to say yes or no, and they said no. But what this is leading me to wonder about is maybe this whole scenario suggests that the question wasn't really asked in the best way in the first place. Just asking people to say, if we find something not relevant to this study, do you want to know, is kind of maybe not enough of a prompt for them to go on. And maybe if they have the option to say yes, no, or something like yes, but only if it's going to save my life, or only if it's actionable, something that would capture a situation like the one in the vignette scenario, but not something like that, something that people would have other reasons for not wanting to know. Maybe what this points to is the need to really ask the question in a more nuanced way in the first place.
So you're stealing my punchline. That's a great point. I think there's certainly ways we could ask the question in a more nuanced manner. I should be clear, this sort of yes/no checkbox does seem to be the common way that research protocols, at least in my research, the examples I've seen, that's a pretty common way to do it. There are probably better ways, but you're raising this important point, and I'm going to make a whole argument to this effect, that we shouldn't even be asking the question. We shouldn't. You're right. If we're going to ask the question and then have this tortured debate about whether or not to honor someone's choice, is it really necessary to ask the question? That's sort of the theme of my of a lot of my research. Okay, anyone else have any last comments before we move on? All right, well, thank you for those thoughts. Let me start sharing my screen again. All right, so so let me take a step back and give you a little bit of history. When we first, about a decade and a half ago, at the beginning of the next generation sequencing era, we started thinking about incidental findings, this right not to know was one area of apparent consensus. The early thinking was, we might debate about which findings to return to people, whether we should be returning them at all. But if we're going to return them, we all agree they should only be returned when they're desired by the research participant. And that implied an obligation to offer the individual findings to research subjects. We weren't forcing them on people. We're saying, hey, would you like this? And in the course of offering, you have to discuss the right not to know, and you have to explicitly solicit subject preferences. And so just to give you one example of some language, incidental findings should only be offered when, quote, during the informed consent process or subsequently, the study participant has opted to receive his or her individual genetic results. The idea here is we're in an opt-in paradigm. You can't just sort of give it to people. You can't tell people you're going to do something. You need to get their explicit opt-in in order to have them accept the offer of receiving this information. So there are a lot of controversies. This didn't seem like one initially. Then enter the ACMG, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics, published a guidance document, recommendations, and they're saying, well, this was in the clinical realm, but it predictably immediately got translated into the research realm. They said, look, if you're sequencing someone, if you're generating whole exome or whole genome sequencing, we're going to say, look, there's this list of incidental findings that we think are really important, and you should actively look through the sequence data to try to find these findings. The initial one was 59. We're up to, 72, 73, something like that. And again, to be clear, we're only talking about things that are, quote, unequivocally pathogenic mutations in genes where pathogenic variants lead to disease with very high probability and where evidence strongly supports the benefits of early intervention. So serious conditions where there's something you can do about it, and where the evidence backing up the connection between the genotype and phenotype is very strong. So 59 is not a huge list. This wasn't an expansive thing. They set the bar intentionally really high. And subsequent research demonstrated that if all of us got sequenced, something in the order of 3% of us, 4% of us would have one of these findings from their list. So it's uncommon, but it's not vanishingly uncommon. So the other thing they said, so that was provocative, but maybe not earth-shatteringly controversial. But the big thing that they said that exploded our genetics and ethics world was, they said, these variants should be returned without soliciting patient preferences about knowing or not knowing. There should just be a default that we return them. We can tell people that we're going to do this, but it doesn't need to be a surprise, but we don't need to solicit patient preferences. An uproar ensued. Eventually, it felt like for a couple of years, every academic conference I went to, would have panels about this, and people were very heated, and there's lots of spirited discussion, and eventually ACMG partially walked back their recommendations. And just, I'm not going to go deep into this, but proponents of the right not to know argue that returning information to patients without soliciting preferences is a violation of their autonomy. You need to get their buy-in in order to return a secondary finding. And they are willing to bite the bullet and say, you know, we recognize, like in the case we just discussed, sometimes these things are going to be life-saving, and if someone said no, we should honor their autonomous choice, even though they might be foregoing a potentially life-saving or important clinical piece of information. So they acknowledged, many of them not acknowledged, that they were willing to make that trade-off. I will put my cards on the table. I am a right not to know skeptic. I don't subscribe to that view on the previous slide. There are lots of reasons, and I can go into any of these in a lot more detail, but let me just run through a few. One, I think it's philosophically, the concept of the right not to know is philosophically shaky. People who are right not to know advocates make it seem like this isn't a long-standing idea, but it actually only emerged around 2000 as a coherent idea, as a coherent concept. And a lot of the early proponents in the philosophical literature were actually fairly skeptical about it, some arguing against it entirely, others, even the strong proponents, saying, you know, this is the kind of right that can be overridden by other considerations, and in fact sometimes imagined the kind of incidental finding that we're talking about here, and saying, yeah, if you can really help someone, you can override their right not to know. There are only very few people who really embraced the very strong conception of the right not to know, the almost absolute conception. Sometimes people make the argument that the right not to know is implied by our right to refuse medical treatment. You know, we all have a right to say no to life-sustaining treatment, even if it will end our lives. And so we should have a similar right to say, well, we don't want information. And I've written an article that refutes that, you know, that the reason we have a right to refuse medical treatment is housed in our bodily integrity. We should be able to control what people do to our body. But there's something very different about psychological integrity, and the courts have not extended bodily integrity to psychological integrity, and there are a lot of reasons why. And in fact, there are a bunch of examples where they've done the opposite and are willing to impose information on people even when they actively don't want it. I have some earlier research that show that opinions are easily shifted. I'm going to show you some more in a moment. I think if you look at sort of the sum total of the pros and cons, if you do sort of cost benefit analysis, I think having a really strong right not to know, where you explicitly ask the question, do you want to know, yes or no? I think that does more harm than good. And again, I'll show you some data in a second that I think backs that up. And there's some other concepts like moral distress and genetic exceptionalism that maybe not dispositive, but they certainly are another argument in favor of being skeptical about the right not to know. And if people are interested, my main article going through all of these is a law review from 5 years ago or so. But these are all theoretical, conceptual debates. And I actually think people make assumptions, make empirical assumptions. And what I wanted to do was to see if I could gather some data to sort of inform those debates. So to start, proponents of soliciting patient preferences assume that their preferences are strong and stable. You know, they said no, they meant no, and that's their answer, and that's going to be their answer over time. And that we can reliably capture these views in the consent process. I should pause and say, you know, there's a lot of literature about how poor and variable people's understanding of basic concepts in consent documents is, and how strong the framing effect can be, depending, like one of the comments earlier, depending how you ask the question, you can get radically different answers. And so it's unclear whether this assumption that you can capture people's strong and stable preferences is a good one. And so I wanted to ask, like, how strongly do patients endorse the right not to know, and how stable are their captured preferences? The second question, there's not a lot of empirical literature on the right not to know, and the studies that are out there are largely qualitative and employ hypothetical scenarios. What would you want to do? Imagine you're in a situation, etc. And so I think there's an interesting empirical question, like, what are the views and characteristics of the people who actually checked no, who actually made the decision to refuse medically actionable genetic information for themselves? So getting into the data, I had an interesting, unique opportunity collaborating with some colleagues at NIH. There's something called the Environmental Polymorphisms Registry. It's this huge environmental study of tens of thousands of people who've contributed samples. It just changed its name to Personalized Environment and Gene Study if you Google it, but it used to be the EPR. And so they had all these samples, they had all these participants that they had ongoing contact with, and they wanted to do sequencing. And so they recontacted participants. And before they talked to me, they asked the question, do you want to know, yes or no? And the question said something like, we may find gene changes that are not related to this study. And if you give consent, you will return findings when there's, quote, a gene change that's important to you or your family's health. So they asked this of tons of people and had this relatively large cohort of people who said no. I say relatively because in the literature, it's always only 1 or 2% of a cohort that says no, which makes it very hard to do this kind of research because most genetic studies aren't this big, but they were big enough that they actually had a critical mass such that we could do a survey. So the goal of our survey was to gauge the strength and stability of their original decisions, to determine how informed they were when they made it, and whether giving them just a little bit more detailed information changed their desire to receive or not receive secondary findings. And I wanted to know a little bit more about why they were making these decisions. In particular, there was this, the people who said no were disproportionately minority Black population. And so I was interested in whether anything was going on there. So we got 2 groups from this large cohort. There were 165 people who refused initially out of the approximately 8,500 who had agreed to be sequenced. So they asked 10,000 people, will you be sequenced? About 8,500 of them said yes. And then they asked, well, if we find these secondary findings, do you want to know them? And 165 said no. We also had a random sample of acceptors as controls. And we oversampled minorities because we were interested in some of those questions I just mentioned. So it was a survey. There's part 1 where we asked them questions about their original decision. Part 2 where we gave them a little bit more information about secondary findings, and then vitally gave them an opportunity to make a new binding choice. This wasn't theoretical. Whatever they chose was going to be recorded by the study team and it was going to be their new their new answer. And part 3, then we asked them questions similar to part 1 about this new decision. The kinds of questions we were asking: how well do you remember being asked? Like, how much did this register with you? What we asked people what their original decision was. Did you have enough information? Did you think about changing your decision? We asked them to sort of, as an accuracy check, how well they understood what kinds of findings could be returned. We gave them 7 categories to pick from, only one of which was actually something that would have been returned. And we wanted to know, we asked them questions about why they made their original decision. And the intervention, just to give you a flavor of it, we told them, look, we're only looking for genes, we're only talking about serious conditions. We're not looking for things that are related to less serious conditions. We're only talking about things that are preventable or treatable. We're not looking for things like dementia diseases that are untreatable. And we're only looking for things where there's a clearly demonstrated connection between the gene and the disease risk. So these are all, you should remember these from the ACMG discussion. We're only looking for this very high bar set of things. And then the part 3 questions, like I said, they had a new binding decision. How sure are you about the decision? Did you have enough information? Again, a understanding check to see how well they understood and why they made their new decision. So the results, the response rate was okay. It was about 50% for refusers and slightly below that for acceptors. We asked them, like, how well do you remember this? We wanted to understand this. In the literature, it makes it seem like this right not to know is something that's at the forefront of everyone's mind, or for at least people that feel very strongly about it, this is something they think about a lot or care about a lot. And so interestingly, there really wasn't very much difference. There was some difference, but not a ton between the acceptors and the refusers about how well they remembered that being asked that question. Most people felt like they had enough information to make the decision, and most people didn't feel like they had thought about changing their mind since then. I think this is really interesting. So this is the concordance question. We asked them, like, do you remember what do you remember? How did you answer the question? And so the people that accepted, only 6.8% incorrectly said, oh, I said no. They had said yes, and almost all of them remembered that they said yes. But in contrast, nearly half, 45.8% of the people who refused misremembered and thought that they had said that they wanted this information. So this was a first clue that something funny is going on here. If so many people, if there's such a difference between acceptors and refusers in how they remember how they answered that initial question. So I just made this point, concordance was poor for refusers, but not for acceptors, and it was a significant finding. So here are some charts comparing some different groups. Right now, let's just focus on the top left one, which is comparing acceptors and refusers pre-intervention. So this is their check of understanding. Column 2 is the only column, the only answer where we're actually returning findings. So information about diseases that might be serious or fatal, like, that's what we would have returned to people. So ideally, everyone would have said, yes, we're getting column 2, and no, we're getting everything else. But you can see that's not the case. Across the board, the acceptors thought they were getting more information, incorrectly in most cases. So maybe they were just sort of optimistic or information seeking, but some of these were the first 2 that I circled, the big ovals, which were statistically significant, but the rest weren't. But you can see this steady trend where acceptors just thought they were getting more kinds of information. We'll come back to B and C in a minute. So we asked them reasons for making the original decision. Acceptors, most of them said, understandably, because it would improve our health. And 61% of them roughly said this is the most important reason why they wanted this information. A lot of them thought it would be helpful to relatives. That's great. Some of them were just curious. But refusers, more interestingly, about half of them said they didn't want it because it might make them sad or worried. Some of them just weren't curious. And interestingly, in the bioethics literature, there's a lot of worry about people's concern about health insurance discrimination and being stigmatized, but those were not reasons that were very readily endorsed by refusers. That was not driving their decision not to get this information. We asked them, one of the options was because you don't trust the NIH with the data, and only African Americans, only Black respondents endorsed this reason, but more than 10% of them did. So that was an interesting finding. So remember, we gave them more information, then we gave them an opportunity to make a new binding choice. And so here's the sort of punchline. Of the people who originally refused, about half of them, 41 out of the 83, now accepted, changed their answer from refused to accepted. Interestingly, of the 442 people who originally accepted, 6 of them changed to refused. So it went in both directions, and we had some tortured conversations about that small group of people changing their answer to the other direction, but we honored it. So about half the people about half refusers changed their mind to accept, but only a handful of acceptors changed their mind to refusers. People were still pretty sure about their decision across the board and felt like they had enough information to make that decision. Okay, I promised we'd come back to these. So focusing on B, so these are all respondents comparing pre, the light blue, to post intervention, the dark blue. And so hopefully what you'd see here is an improvement in people's understanding. And in fact, we do see that for number 2, where that's the only category of information they'd actually get, it went up slightly, not significantly, but slightly. And for all the other ones, it went down, which again is correct. We want people to understand that they're not getting those other categories. And all of those were statistically significant. So as an educational intervention, this seemed to be very successful, going from above 50% for most of the categories incorrectly to below 50%. So that was good. And the last one is acceptors versus strong refusers post-intervention. We wanted to see if there was a difference between and strong refusers, I should say, are people that refused at both time points. So said no and then said no again. And you can see that that the acceptors were the strong refusers actually had a better understanding about what was or wasn't going to be returned, except that they're slightly lower on and being correct about the second column, but for all the other columns they were lower. Some of them were statistically significant, but most of them weren't. Okay, so let me get into some discussion. I think the first point I want to take out of this is that refusers aren't a monolithic group. Sometimes people in the literature, it seems like, everyone who's exercising their right not to know is the same, and I don't think that's fair. I think, at least from our data, you can say that there are these strong refusers, people who declined at both time points, and a roughly equal number of weak refusers, people who declined and then accepted. Strong refusers demonstrated much higher concordance. They remembered what they had decided earlier and were able to recite it back. On the flip side, though, 75% of weak refusers incorrectly thought they had agreed to receive secondary findings. So all of that lack of concordance was coming from this group of weak refusers who, not sure what's going on, but maybe they didn't understand the question, maybe they weren't paying attention, maybe they just checked the wrong box, but something was going on here where it was not, asking the question was not accurately capturing their views. And it wasn't quite significant, but there was a trend for strong refusers to not, to be less likely to have thought about changing their decision. But they really did understand, as I showed in the previous figures, they really understood the different categories and what was or wasn't going to be returned. So remember, strong right not to know advocates argue that some patients and research participants have this genuine preference not to know certain information about themselves, and that we should actively solicit their views and respect their autonomous choice. And they advocate that these views should be solicited, and there shouldn't be a default practice of returning secondary findings. And the assumption made here is that a patient or participant, whatever they say on the consent form, always reflects their true considered view. I think that our data calls this into question. I've long been a skeptic of checkboxes, and I'm not sure that they should be seen as a definitive way of capturing people's preferences about the right not to know, particularly in the context of these 10, 15, 20 page legalistic documents that even I, as part of my job, occasionally have to read and have trouble getting through. And we're asking people to make these binding, really important choices in the middle of it. I'm not sure that's a great strategy. Because almost half of our refusers change their minds. So something's going on here where we're not actively capturing their views. And there's clearly a risk that if you ask the question, some participants are going to make a choice that results in foregoing potentially life-saving information that, upon further reflection, they might have wanted to receive. So on the other hand, though, there's clearly this group of people who really don't want to know, these strong refusers. And they don't want to know despite really understanding what they're saying no to, or seemingly understanding what they're saying no to. And if we had a policy where we didn't actively solicit preferences, these strong refusers may not have an obvious mechanism to opt out of potentially receiving information that they genuinely don't want to receive. So what do we do about this? We've got these two groups of people who both have some interests. You could have a more robust consent process where you spent a whole page and 20 minutes with the genetic counselor talking about this. I'm not sure in terms of resources that's a realistic way to go. We don't have the time, we don't have the expertise to really engage in a robust conversation about this with every research participant. And we already have, as I've already mentioned, a consent form length problem. And people aren't very good at digesting what they're being presented in a consent form. But it's still, we could try to do better with our consent process. We could ask for preferences at multiple time points. We could sort of build that in to the process. That could be the mechanism at work in our data. Maybe it was just the act of asking a second time caused people to reconsider what they had said earlier and change their mind. So maybe we could, for everyone, ask a second time and tell people we're going to ask a second time. And that would mitigate the concern I raised about sort of cluing people into the fact that there's data out there, there's finding out there that might impact them. If we ask a second time and we tell everyone we're going to ask them a second time, that's not as much a concern. That's a logistical challenge, however, and a resource challenge. You'd have to keep track of people over time and get back to them. And so that is not it's not a slam dunk. I do some work with the All of Us research program, and they have hundreds of thousands of people who they'd have to track and ask at multiple time points. And that's just they're an outlier in their size, but it would be a lot of work for any study. But my argument, I mean, those are I'm not gonna say no to those approaches, but my view is that we should return to the ACMG idea that there's a default practice of returning medically actionable genetic findings to research participants without actively soliciting their preferences. Strong refusers were a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of the EPR cohort. And so I think I think our data raised this really interesting normative question. Should right not to know policies, the question of whether or not we should ask the question, be constructed to accommodate this tiny group of people, given I think you can say, the possible harms to patients or participants who might misreport or misselect what they want on a consent form? Or to say it in a different way, whose interests are more important, the weak or the strong refusers? My view is that I am more interested in the chance to save someone's life than the worry about protecting someone from information. That's just my view. I think reasonable people can disagree about this, but to me, this is the normative question. you've got to pick one of these groups, either the weak or the strong refusers, and say, I think their views and their interests are more important than the competing group. But just to throw a wrench into it, I'm not saying that strong refusers, we have to give them this information and tell them even if they say no. If there was a clear but passive opt-out mechanism where if people raise their own hand, we're not going to ask them the question, but if they say, you know, researcher, I don't want this information, is there a way for me not to get it? Then there would be a way to honor that request if they raise it themselves and really do clearly understand what they're saying no to. So I'm not saying that we have to throw away the right not to know altogether. We just shouldn't ask the question and let people for whom it's really important self-identify. A few more points. The relationship between understanding and right not to know decisions remains unclear. We had some contradictory results. Higher understanding generally led to higher rates of accepting, but the strong refusers have the highest level of understanding. So that's not a rule we can articulate. And some acceptors had very poor understanding. They thought they were getting a lot more than they actually were. We need to understand this causal relationship between being better informed and wanting more information about oneself, and what was going on, why people were changing their mind. I think there's some opportunities for targeted education to combat specific misconceptions that appeared in our data. So people that said this information will make me sad, there's a lot of effective forecasting literature that if we educated people about it, you know, the gist of that literature is, you know, when people find out bad news about their genetic risk for disease, they're briefly and minorly sad, but then get over it and are glad that they know, generally. And so but we're also really bad at predicting our future affective states. So if we told people that, could that maybe mitigate this concern? Health insurance discrimination, even though it was a small number, we could educate people about GINA and the Affordable Care Act and the protections that those put in place. The people that say, you know, it's not relevant to my health, we just need to do a better job explaining what genetic findings are and how they can be useful. But to my mind, I think we should maybe re-examine some of the assumptions we make in the literature about why people don't want genetic information. There's this worry about stigma. That was not something driving people's choices. Access to healthcare, similarly, people were not worried about healthcare discrimination. And why were African Americans disproportionately represented among refusers? What is going on with this mistrust of NIH government, and is there any way we can combat that? And what were the 6 people who switched from accepting to refusing doing? What did they think? What were they thinking? So just to conclude, I think our data raised questions about whether a strong conception of the right not to know is the right lens when thinking about how to construct policies in research protocols to govern the return of secondary findings. I would argue that we should have a default practice of returning secondary findings without soliciting preferences, but while providing a clear but passive opt-out mechanism. And I've explored this idea in a recent piece more generally about this idea of choice masking nudges in medical research. When do you not even have to ask a question? And so if people are interested in sort of behavioral economics and the concept of nudging and how it might play in the research context, I point people towards this recent law review article. Let me acknowledge my co-authors who were great help in this project. This paper came out in Genetics and Medicine last year, so if people want to see it in more detail, you're welcome to. And with that, let me say thank you, and I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ben. And if people would like to ask questions, you can use the raise hand function. If you're not familiar with it, click on reactions at the bottom of your screen, and the raise hand option will be right there. You click on raise hand, we'll get you in the queue. But let me take the opportunity while people are thinking about their questions, Ben, to ask you something about your data and perhaps ask you to reflect on their implications. If I understood your slide correctly about the levels of correct understanding of whether the various categories would or would not be returned, even after you went through a fairly comprehensive educational process, more than 25% of your participants got it wrong in just about every category. And even where they got it right the most, which was what was going to be returned, it was close to 20-25% of people who got that wrong as well. How should we understand what's going on here?
Well, I mean, maybe we just add this to the giant pile of data and papers that paint this terrifying picture about how poorly people engage with consent forms. Basic concepts like randomization and placebo. People just, when you really interrogate whether or not they understand what they are agreeing to in the consent form, it's just paper after paper that says, you know, we're not great at really understanding it. It makes me nervous. I mean, I'm not going to go as far as to say we need to re-examine all of consent, their informed consent process, but I do worry that anytime you're trying to convey information, complicated information, and make have people make choices, we should be very cautious about how we're doing it and not ask people to do too much decision making in the process of doing consent. To the extent we can have more live conversations, I think that will always help. But just the act of reading a 10 or 15 page dense consent form is not easy, even for people who do it for a living. And so I worry that our consent forms are going in the wrong direction. But I don't know what to do with it. It seems like a systemic problem. It's certainly not a problem that's unique to genetics or the right not to know, but it seems to be somewhat acute in this context.
Okay, Meryl, you want to unmute yourself and maybe even turn on your camera?
Yeah, I can't do camera right now, but I actually had an opinion and then was gonna ask a question, but Dr. Applebaum actually got to the heart of my question, but I think the framing is still relevant. So my positionality is that I'm a clinical genetic counselor who is both close to the physicians who made the ACMG recommendations and have dealt with this a lot in clinic and giving back these kinds of results. But then I'm also on the academic side, a PhD student in social welfare. And so I think about this education issue a little bit differently and integrate it into these findings, which, by the way, your study is awesome in terms of trying to get to the bottom of this. But I think that the strong refusers are actually the group, back to your normative question, the strong refusers are the group that we need to pay attention to the most for a couple reasons. They tend to be better educated on it, and the level of lack of education understanding about what's going on is so high that you almost would want to honor those who actually do have sort of a strong understanding, but also because it systemically would mean that Black African-American folks are getting back these results as the group of strongest refusers. I think your data had spoke to that a little bit, that group would be systematically not getting these results back, but also statistically, the number of weak refusers who are going to change. If you sort of think about these conditions and what background screening we're already doing and the amount of difference it would actually make in actually saving lives, statistically, that number would be very, very small. And so it seems important to protect these strong refusers, especially because they're the ones that are systematically already not trusting research, are sort of the folks that understand why they're refusing the best, and because the benefit would be quite minor to ignoring them from a statistical standpoint. And so for me, sort of that question of can we trust people who aren't necessarily understanding the education? In my experience, those who don't understand what's going on are much more likely to accept everything just as a blanket default. And so should we honor those opinions that are sort of grounded a little bit more heavily?
So that's a great argument. I mean, I respectfully say I'm not sure I agree with it, but that's the kind of engagement in the normative question that, like, we could have a back and forth about why we should honor why we should pay more attention to this educated group of people that's making a truly informed choice not to know something. Like, that's a good argument. Although I would counter by saying, you're right in saying that absolute number of people whose lives we would save is going to be very small. My counter to that is the absolute number of people on whom we would be imposing unwanted information is going to be very similarly small. And so the burden on those people is actually going to be also fairly minute.
Yeah,
so
although
again,
I would expect that if you reconsented a lot of the acceptors, you may find more data that supports the trend that some of them turn to refusing, since the better educated you are, the more likely you are to refuse. So it would be interesting to actually, not that this is possible, but do fully capture all those that accepted to see if that number really remains small at the end of it, or does the number of refusers really significantly change?
Well, one of my follow-on studies I hope to do is a more in-depth qualitative interview study, talking to some of these refusers and acceptors to better understand their thinking, and to ask some of the kinds of questions you're asking, and see if some of these relationships, like between education and refusing, actually bears out. So thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Worry? Yes, thank you, Meryl. Do you worry, Ben, that taking away the option to refuse, particularly in communities that may have strong feelings on whatever basis about not getting those results back, will discourage them for participation in research, and that those might be the very communities that we're working so hard to encourage to participate, so that we have more equitable basis for genetic analyses?
I very much worry about that, and it's an issue that we, not in the genetics and medicine paper, but in the more recent law review about choice masking nudges, we engage with that, and I think it cuts both ways. If you're being perceived as going against people's autonomy and imposing information on them that's unwanted, that could certainly damage relationships. But I think it's also a possibility that if it turns out that someone or a group learns, like, oh, these researchers had an important piece of information that they didn't share with us, and yeah, I know I checked no, but like, come on, this could have saved my life, like, that could also damage trust. And so I think it can cut both ways, and so I think this might not be satisfying, but at least the very least you can say is, when you're dealing with these identified populations that might already have a historical distrust of institutions, particularly the medical institutions, we should be really careful and cautious about using choice masking nudges, like not asking this question, and we should have a really good reason and be really careful before we engage in that, because you're right, it could do more harm than good. And so even though I still think this is the right answer generally, for these specific targeted groups, minority groups in particular, it might change the calculus.
So we just have a minute left, but let me play off one of the comments that's appeared in the chat here, which mentions something that didn't come up in your argument today, which is the potential value to families and follow-up cascade testing of knowing about a genetic propensity for serious illness. Is that something that you have factored into your thinking about it?
I do. I mean, so in my conceptual work, I've tried to isolate the arguments just thinking about the individual, because if I can demonstrate that the right not to know, when you're only talking about someone's self-regarding interest or arguments about knowing or not knowing information, if I can make an argument that says we should be skeptical about the right not to know in that context, then I don't need to think about the second order third party effects. But I think the fact that this information is not just relevant to the person, but can also help everyone in their family, just adds more reason to be skeptical about the right not to know. You're not really just saying, I don't want to know for me. You're effectively saying, I don't want to know for me, and I also want to forego some opportunity for my relatives. And so when you start adding those third-party interests in, I think it only strengthens the idea that we should be skeptical about the right not to know.
So obviously we could have a lot more conversation about many of the issues that you raised, but we're at 1 o'clock and we need to let people go. But thank you very much, Ben, for a really a great and extremely interesting talk. And thank you to all of you who attended. Come join us next month when Susan Gelman on May 16th will be doing our next seminar. So thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you all. Please email me if you have any questions.